Hey guys, and welcome back to our lectures on Unit 5. We're going to keep going with biogeochemical cycles now, and we just talked about the nitrogen cycle, which is probably the most important cycle that we'll talk about in this course, but we're going to keep talking about some more important cycles as well, and we'll keep going with the sulfur and the sulfur bacterial cycle. Now, sulfur, of course, is a very important element that we find in the environment, and we use it again for important biological molecules. We find it in a bunch of amino acids, which makes it important in configuration of proteins, protein shapes, and so on. So it's quite an important element for us to follow. Now, the bacteria that are involved in the chemical in the cycling of sulfur include sulfate-reducing bacteria, sulfur-reducing bacteria, and sulfur-oxidizing bacteria. So we're going to have a look at these bacteria and what they do in the next couple of slides. Now, here are our species of sulfur that we're going to be talking about. We've got our S2, which is going to be a solid that we'll find in the environment, in the lithosphere, in rocks and soil and dirt. We'll find sulfate, which we can find in the atmosphere, in the water, and also in the dirt. We'll have hydrogen sulfide gas, which will be a gas that can be held in water, or it can be released into the atmosphere. And that's got a rotten egg smell to it. If you've ever walked across a wetland or a marsh and you've smelled like rotten eggs, then you've smelled hydrogen sulfide. And then the last one we have is sulfur dioxide, which is a gas that we'll find in the atmosphere. Alright, so let's have a look at our first group of organisms, and these are the sulfate-reducing bacteria. Now, these are amongst the oldest forms of bacteria on the planet, so these are going to be found in that group we talked about earlier, the archaea. I think I spelled that right. So these are going to be around 3 billion years old. They're anaerobic. They would have evolved in an era before the planet was highly oxygenated, so we wouldn't operate with oxygen. And what they do is they convert sulfates, those SO4 to negative, which is the best form of sulfur for plants to grow, and they turn it into hydrogen sulfide gas, which is going to give us that rotten egg smell. So you guys can remember me telling you guys stories about being at hot springs and you can smell this rotten egg smell. Well, a hot spring is a place where you're going to find these archaea, these ancient bacteria, and this would be certainly one of these types of bacteria that you'd find there. So an example of a species that does that is the Desulfovibrio species, and you can have a look at them over here. Vibrio, you can see there that curved rod shape, and then what type of flagella? Well, I'll leave that for you guys. So here's a look at what these sulfate-reducing bacteria do. Like I said, they'll take the SO4, which can be released into the atmosphere from industry, but it can also be released from other means as well. And when that falls into a wetland, for example, where we have these bacteria living in muds and sediments, those bacteria will take that sulfate. It'll be decomposed, changed a little bit. It'll be combined with hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and lactic acid, ethanol, that type of fermentation. And then we can have it turned into our sulfate reducers. We'll take that, the SO4, and they'll turn it into our H2S. That'll be released, and then if anyone is around this wetland, then they'll probably get a smell of rotten eggs. Another way that they can do this, and this isn't our sulfate reducers, but this is another group that we can find in this environment, are the methanogens. And what they'll do is they'll take that sulfate, and instead of turning it into hydrogen sulfide, they'll turn it into methane. And then that methane will go up into the atmosphere, and it'll contribute to those greenhouse gases. Methanogen also smells kind of like rotten eggs, or it's got a bad smell. You would recognize methane smell if you smelled it once. Now, the next group are going to be our sulfur-reducing bacteria. What these bacteria are going to do is, again, they're going to be anaerobic, so they'll be operating without oxygen, and when they don't have sunlight available for photosynthetic reactions, what they'll do is they'll take that solid sulfur that we'll find in the soil, in the rocks, and they'll turn that sulfur into hydrogen sulfide, and when they do that, they'll get a certain amount of energy. So instead of photosynthesizing to get energy, they can reduce sulfur, in order to get energy. So this is another example of one of those strange metabolisms that I told you about that only bacteria tend to have. We can take advantage of this process, and we have. We can use sulfur-reducing bacteria in industrial processes, and this will help us generate hydrogen sulfide, which we can then use to precipitate metals. So we have found ways to use these ancient metabolisms to our advantage. Now, the last type of equations we're going to talk about are our sulfur oxidizing bacteria. Now, our sulfur oxidizing bacteria are going to be able to take several different species of sulfur. You can see here we've got sulfur dioxide, and iron sulfate, and they're going to be able to turn that into sulfuric acid. Now, sulfuric acid is a very strong acid. It can be toxic to living organisms, and it can also lower the pH in the environment, to around 1 to 2, which is the same as the pH in our stomachs. So very low, very acid environment. In fact, sulfuric acid is often used in car batteries to generate energy. So it can be a pretty nasty compound that these bacteria can create. And now finally, here's a look at our sulfur cycle. And I'm not going to expect you guys to know a lot of detail about this. I just want you to know that sulfur does cycle through the environment, and it does move around through the help of bacteria. But if we look for our important species of sulfur, let's have a quick look at this cycle. So we've got our sulfur dioxide that's often released through air pollution. We've got our hydrogen sulfide that's in the atmosphere. We also have hydrogen sulfide that we can find in water and even in soil as well. So we can have hydrogen sulfide present in a lot of different places. Now, here's where we look at the different reactions that bacteria are involved in. So we've got oxidation here, we've got reduction, we've got again reduction, oxidation, and finally we get assimilation. Now, what assimilation means is living organisms are able to take this sulfate, which is good for plants and algae, and they can assimilate that into their tissue. So this is how the sulfate would get into the biological world. And then all of these reactions, or combinations of these reactions, are what will allow it to move back into the abiotic world. So, like I said, I don't expect you to know all of these steps like you would on the nitrogen cycle, but it is good to know how the sulfur cycle functions, what species or what bacteria are involved, and how it functions, how it fits into on a bigger picture. Okay, the next cycle we'll look at is the phosphorus cycle. Now, if you look at the picture here, you can see that there's not a whole, it just seems a little bit simpler than the last ones we look at, and a lot of the action that's happening in the phosphorus cycle is happening in the abiotic, or the non-living part of the environment. There are parts though that are controlled by bacteria, and those are the ones that we're interested in. Alright, so phosphorus is another quite important element, and it's going to be something that we use in biological important compounds, so that's why we're talking about it in this class. Now, our cycle here is, we're looking at it in a fairly simplified version, but what we're looking at is the way phosphorus moves around in the environment is moving from organic phosphates, which we find in plant and animal waste, and then it moves into inorganic phosphates, which we find in soil and rock. Now, these movements are not necessarily controlled, but bacteria are involved in these steps. So let's have a quick look. Alright, so we have bacteria that live in the soil, and they help us move along, or they help cycle phosphorus between the organic phosphates that are released from dead organisms, and bacteria will take those organic phosphates and they'll turn them into inorganic phosphates. So basically, they'll take phosphates that were once tissue from animals and plants, and they'll turn it into soil, and minerals and rock. So those are one group of bacteria. Now we have another group of bacteria that are going to take those inorganic molecules of phosphorus, and they're going to switch those into orthophosphates, so PO4 negative. Now PO4 negative, that's going to be a molecule that can be used by other plants and other microorganisms. If again you go back to that fertilizer example and you get that ratio of N to P to K, well, the N we already talked about was nitrogen, the P is going to be phosphorus, and then the last one is going to be potassium, but we're not too worried about potassium in this course. So here's a look at our phosphorus cycle, and remember what we're doing is we're watching phosphorus go from organic phosphates that living things can use to inorganic phosphates, which basically turn into soil and rock. So although we can have phosphates moving in this direction over here where they get kind of lost, we're not too worried about this. What we're looking at is our organisms over here. So we've got our plants, we've got our animals, and then when they decompose and they die, these organisms in the soil will turn this organic phosphate into inorganic phosphates, which is basically soil and rock. Now those soils and rock, they can be lost into the ocean, which is when we go into this cycle over here, what I'm not too worried about, or they can be converted back from inorganic phosphates into orthophosphates, which can then be used again by plants and animals for metabolism and biomass. And that's more or less what we're worried about in this cycle, in this phosphorus cycle. So we're only worried about the reactions that we see in this area right here. Now, fertilizers and detergents, that's going to come up in our next topic.